I'll give a talk about downtown Independence, but I want to concentrate on the year 1945. That's the year that my parents and I moved to Independence, and I'll talk about that a little bit more on. So I did that, and so I talked to the chamber, and then I'm a member of the Rotary Club, and so I had a captive audience at Rotary and told them about early independence. The Lions Club heard of my talk, and so I gave it to the Central Lions Club. And more recently, in the newer Independence Community Center, I gave a talk there. And so I've had some practice at it. But for the first time, we have taken some pictures of many of the downtown Independence buildings today, so that you can relate by seeing what's there today with what was there 1945. Afterwards, come up and look at this. There are about 4 pictures of some of the early buildings. I'll point to them now. This was the livery stable that's in the area where Moothart's Grocery is now. And that was built in 1855. We utilized the building for a while. This was a building along Monmouth Street where Umpqua Bank's parking lot is now, and it was secondhand items and furniture and so on. Governor Mark Hatfield and his wife Antoinette would come to Independence on occasion, shop for antique furniture here, and then they'd go across the street to Taylor's and have a sarsaparilla. This is the ISIS Theater, no relation to the ISIS that we hear about today. The theater building was built in 1913. Ross Nelson was owner and operator of the theater, and he also owned the theater building in Monmouth, a small, narrow building, and that's where Haugen's photography is today. And this was Independence City Hall, no longer a building there. It's a parking lot, part of a service station lot, but it was right on the alley, kind of across from Umpqua Bank, a 2-story building. These were the 2 fire stalls. And upstairs was this where the City Hall met, and I was a JC in the early or in the mid-40s, and we met upstairs too there, and I've got a story to tell about that. So look at this afterwards. Paul Robinson was the principal of Independence High School from 1925 till 1950 when they merged with Central. And my dad worked for the power company as an appliance salesman. In 1939, he was transferred to Mandan, North Dakota, where Lewis and Clark spent their first winter. And then in 42, through my mother's urging, they decided to come out to Portland, Oregon to work in the shipyards, which they both did. The war was still on in 1945, and we as a family had saved enough money to be able to open a store. And so we moved to Independence and opened a Western Auto Store June 8th of 1945. Keep in mind that I was 13 years old at the time, and this was 72 years ago, so my recollection will be as good as it can be. In 1945, and the building you see there didn't exist, that's where the livery stable that I pointed out is on this board was. It had been built in 1855 and was used for horses and hay storage and so on. In later years, and I'm guessing maybe about 1950 or so, my dad had a customer that wanted some roofing material. And we, Western Auto, didn't have roofing, but we connected with a maker of roofing materials in Portland, and a flatbed truck brought down, I don't know how many square or how many bundles of roofing, but we rented the livery stable to store it while we were to get it unloaded and then to deliver it to the customers. I weighed about 130 pounds at the time, and the roofing bundles weighed 90 pounds. But what I remember about the building, and it was up on stilts, and you could look down through the slats, the breaks in the 2x12s or whatever they were, the flooring, and you could see Ash Creek flowing underneath the building. And today, of course, Ash Creek is still there and just at the edge of the parking lot from this store. So we'll take a virtual visual walking tour around downtown Independence. Jane and I took these pictures the other day. The next building to the south from Moothart's is, of course, the tall Sperling building, originally a hotel, and Then in later years, it was the Beaver Hotel and was well used by folks coming to visit the soldiers at Camp Adair. Camp Adair, by the way, became the second largest city in Oregon in the 40s, with about 44,000 troops at Camp Adair, just south of Monmouth. And earlier, part of it had been a bank, and now, of course, downstairs is the home of the Italian restaurant. Moving down the street to the south, this is known as the Belt Building. Not yet in 45, but in later years after that, Dan Weaver bought the building and has done a great job in frontal restoration and has built his apartment upstairs. Main Street Antiques was his business for many years, but it's, I think, sort of closed down now. But you still see Dan downtown with his old Dachshund walking around on occasion. Next was the large frontage was Addison Furniture Company. And I'll point out that my dad's name was Elmer. Elmer is not that much a common name anymore of men. But in 1945, there were 4 Elmers in downtown Independence. My dad, Elmer Addison, had the furniture store, and it was a wide frontage and went clear to the alley, so many displays of furniture there. Next was the Palace Tavern. Today, it's the Arena Sports Bar, and I can recall during hop picking season and so on and walking by and glancing into the Palace that sometimes it seemed like people were about 12 persons deep trying to get back to the bar to get their beer glass refilled. So it was very popular. And keep your ears here indicating the number of taverns, the number of drugstores and grocery stores in downtown Independence in those earlier years. Next to the palace is what today is the River Gallery, the art display from local artists. And in 1945, it was Tom and Dean Smith's IGA store. Mrs. Smith kept the books, and you could charge your groceries. They just wrote it up on the little charge slip and so on, and then you'd come in monthly to pay your bill to Mrs. Smith. But Tom and Dean were there for many years. They had a steak truck. They delivered groceries around town on a daily, I think on a daily basis. On the corner where we opened our store, it had been a number of uses. By the way, the Oddfellows, the IOOF Lodge, at one time were in what is now Dan Weaver's building, and then later the corner building was the Oddfellows Hall. They met upstairs. We rented the front part going back about 80 feet, and the rent was $40 a month, 1945. There had been a number of other businesses in that old building, of course, but in 1945 we took over from the Makoff family, M-A-K-O-F-F, a Russian family. They had dry goods. The cash register we acquired from them, and it is now on display at the Heritage Museum. I had given it to my son, and he didn't really have any use for it, so he brought it back from Bend, and Dennis Eberly and I and my son helped unload it from the pickup truck, slid it in on some planks, and got it into the first floor just inside the entrance of the museum, and that's where it is today. It is heavy as hell. So anyway, we took over from the Makoffs, we got the cash register, and even some of their inventory. During the war, hardware was hard to come by, and so we actually had some of their clothing items and continued to go to Portland to wholesalers and buy some clothing, so we were selling some clothing along with our limited hardware. For our grand opening, which was on June 8th, 1945, and I remember my dad handing me the key to go down and unlock the front door, but we had then just some samplings of the double-coated enamelware, the white with the red trim, pots and pans, so we had some of those. We had a few metal lunch pails, which had not been available during the war. We had some flashlight batteries, which again were scarce, and such items as that to put in the window to display to attract the buyers. We did find some silk hosiery from the Makoffs among all their items, and so we did have some silk hose to sell, which of course were rare to have well into the war. That first year, and I think maybe several years thereafter, They would bring in Mexican nationals from Mexico on a train to help harvest the hops because, of course, many of the younger people, the young men, were away still fighting the war. And about 300 of them on a train, and I'm even guessing that they maybe then stayed on the train cars and slept on the Pullman cars while they were here during hop harvest. Continuing on south, one of the two tower buildings in downtown Independence, and it was known as the J.S. Cooper Building. And in 1945, the downstairs, I'll talk about the upstairs more later, but the downstairs was Williams Drugstore, drugstore number 1. Next on south was Craven's Confectionery. Bob Craven spoke teenage language. Very popular. After school, after games, and so on. Craven's was a gathering. The Johnson boys, there were I think 4 or 5 in the family, and the Johnson brothers, most all of them through the years worked for Bob. His daughter Phyllis Stewie worked there. And 4 years later, when I was a senior in high school and playing football, I weighed about 129 pounds. And so after practice, I'd come down maybe several days a week and have Bob fix me up a chocolate double malted milkshake with a raw egg added, thinking that maybe all of this concoction would add some weight to my slim body. Next was Eldon Mull's Bowling Alley, and these were duck pins, shorter than the regular bowling pin, with I think a rubber bumper around them. The bowling balls were somewhat bigger than a shot put with no finger holes in it, and you just grabbed the larger ball and rolled it down the alleyway. And we kids were able to sometimes get the job of setting pins at the end of the alleyway and then would earn free bowling opportunities. So Mull, and Eldon was also, I think, maybe a deputy sheriff or some police work too in his other job. Next was a burned out building, and today it's Sojourns Cosmetics. In 1945 it was burned out and it was just a shell. I think the roof was there, but the building area was just wide open. And as it was then filled in and developed initially, then after 1945, it became a Rexall drugstore. And Bob Gray was one of the owners and operators of that. His daughter Shirley was in high school a few years behind me. Next was Calbrus Grocery. This had been a bank originally, and still today you can see the glass windows in the archways, and there was also a glass skylight, and I think it's inside. It's now the Three-Legged Dog Tavern, and but it again in those days, after having been a bank initially, was Calbrus Grocery. And this Mr. and Mrs. Calbreth, they had their fruits and vegetables, some of them on a portable cart that you could roll out. They'd bring it out from the store and have it out on the sidewalk, so you walking by, you were tempted by the fresh fruit and vegetables on display. Later, the building was taken over by the Cullanders, Shorty Cullender, a jeweler, and later in turn his son-in-law Kent Bowersfeld had the jewelry store there that eventually moved to Central Plaza. So that was Calbrus Grocery in 1945, another grocery store. The next building was known as the Opera House and also as Sloper's Hall. The Sloper family, again, hop growers here. Upstairs was a large hall that I heard at one year was used by Oregon's Agricultural College for their commencement. High school, Independence High School, used it for plays. There was a platform. Downstairs, the room was partitioned in two. And the north part was Scranton's Variety Store, Ralph and Blanche Scranton. Ralph was also the volunteer fire chief, and Blanche was in the store, and her displays, there was a walking aisle down the middle, and on each side that she could reach out and reach and hand to you were pencils, erasers, paint sets, all of the school supplies that you'd ever need, and other notions, thread, thimbles, sewing patterns, that sort of thing too. So this was Scranton's, and Ralph was in the store some too. Their two daughters, Lavelle Scranton, was in my class. She married Perry Foster. We'll talk about the Fosters later. And then Yvonne Scranton, who married Jerry Pettit, another high school. He was a little older than I. We played trumpet together. But Yvonne Pettit still does live in Monmouth. The other part was Independence Hardware, and I remember their sign out front under the canopy was a neon shape of a handsaw, and it said hardware on the sign. Theron Hoover was the owner, and Keith Reich, a tall gentleman, was his clerk, and Keith's wife was our high school typewriting teacher, Ruth Reich. And so the two gentlemen there had the hardware store. Yeah, I want to talk about this. This is the upstairs of the Opera House, and Dad and I bought it and moved our business there in 1958. We had problems with mud swallows building their nests in the overhang, and then their drippings were coming down on our canopy and rotting the canvas. And so after putting up with this and for a number of years, one morning I got Dick Taylor, who was a volunteer fireman, and he bought one of the fire trucks and the hose and flushed those mud nests down that were in that overhang in the brackets up there. And unfortunately, there were some babies that came down, so there were some carcasses on the sidewalk below and all the mud. And I think there was a letter to the editor of the newspaper about the cruel Al Oppliger that killed all those mud swallows. So that was not good. Next buildings, which today is the Golden Horse Cafe, housed several restaurants, including Cafe Adair, and also the Hi-Ho restaurant, I think, was in there initially for a while. And actually, John Poff had his insurance business there. Clyde Wunder was an accountant and also had business there, along with Rudy Frickberg, a high school classmate. To the corner, Taylor's Drug for many, many years. Initially, in 1945, it was known as Sylvester Drug, another drugstore. And Mr. Sylvester was a watchmaker, and there was sort of a cage-like area in the middle of the store where he sat and did his watch repair work. There was a fountain there, and Marilyn Mix, we'll get to her father's name in a minute, worked there. And so it was a drugstore in 1945, and later, not too long after that, Taylor's Drug opened. Dick and Dee Taylor brothers, Marge, the wife, and Billy K. Harrell, a daughter, and I saw Billy Kay just yesterday at the Heritage Museum. Taylor's there, and the sign is still there, and the building is currently, if you've driven by, Bodie Bemrose, who has restored several buildings in downtown Independence. Bodie has worked on it and is ready now to be rented or sold, leased, whatever. We next jump across the street to the second tower building in downtown Independence. And this was the First National Bank of Independence, an independent bank, not connected with First National of Oregon. So First National Bank of Independence, and of course subsequently it's been the Sperling Bank and Umpqua Bank. I guess it was Key Bank for a while also. So it continues to be used as a bank. There was a dentist upstairs in this building at one time. Side note, in 1959, the covered wagons came to Independence from Independence, Missouri. And I was a JC. In fact, I had the job of being in charge of the large parade, the grand parade that day, that I think had 300 horses and over 1,000 people in the parade. But we had a television reporter that came to town and had a cameraman, and so he took place upstairs in the balcony in one of the open windows there. And his name was Tom McCall. And one of the JCs was up there with Tom and kind of briefing him on what was happening and what was coming down Main Street in the parade. And the fire siren went off. And again, the fire hall was just a half a block away on Monmouth Street at the alley. And so Art Piles was the JC, and he suggested that the cameraman pan his camera over there on the building on the alleyway to catch the fire trucks coming out. Well, nothing happened. Turned out that it was the noon whistle. So Tom probably had to stutter a little bit and ad-lib and carry on from there. Next, the open space, which is now the parking lot for the bank, had some farm machinery in there, and I think Clarence Thomas was in charge, and it was either International Harvester or Alice Chalmers brand, but displays of tractors and combines and so on. And again, some of that not really maybe in 1945 because the war was still on and all sorts of machinery like that was in very, very limited supply. Next, this building is under renovation. In 1945, it was Nig Mills Repair Shop. Nig's son, Richard, was a classmate. Nig had lost a leg, and so he had a wooden leg, but he either lost it in a motorcycle accident or in midget race cars. He was a race car driver too. But he did automotive repair. And again, the building's being redone, and I've heard that it's maybe going to become a brewery for craft breweries on Main Street. The next building in 1945 was Hart Motor Company. Jim Hart, and H-A-R-T. Jim, a longtime Independence resident, and he was the Ford dealer. Now, he probably didn't have any new Fords in 1945, but operated there for many years. His son, young Jim, became involved in the Oregon State Fire Marshal's office in later years. So anyway, today it was the spa repair and so on and sales, but now it has just become a vintage store with handicrafts and used items and so on. They were operating up in the Cooper building for a while earlier. Next, this is just a shot looking north from where we had been of the two towers in downtown Independence. And we'll come back now on the east side of Main Street, where Winokur's dental office is today. Back in 1945, Joe Rogers, our county representative for Polk County for many years, had a creamery there, Rogers Creamery. It was a frame building, and his son Raleigh, again a good friend of mine who lives up in King City now, but they operated their creamery. The story, by the way, I interviewed Barbara Martin as I got ready to give this talk initially. Barbara at the time was 88 years old, lived in the dark green house with a pitch roof, catty-cornered across the street from Independence Elementary School on 3rd or 4th and C Street. Barbara told me that she and two other friends, ladies that I knew, would be picking hops across the river, and then they'd catch the ferry to come home, and they would walk up the street and to Rogers Creamery, and it was late afternoon, and the dairymen were all gone, but there was some wire netting there, but they were able to reach in through the sort of the chicken wire and get into the freezers that were sitting there and reach in there and get some ice cream bars. They'd been picking hops, and they had earned some ice cream bars. I says, Barbara, I'm going to be talking to the Chamber of Commerce about this, and shall I say that you girls actually stole ice cream bars? Barbara Sharp at age 88 says, that's okay, statute of limitations will take care of that. After Rogers Creamery, then Taylor's Grocery was there. Ed Taylor, the father, Dick and Dee, who later were in the drugstore across the street on the corner, and mother Lila. And so they had their grocery store there. Going north, the building downstairs was a large hardware store, A.L. Thomas Hardware. And A.L.'s wife, Ivy, is the lady that then took all the earnings from the hardware store over the years and is the lady whose estate has contributed millions of dollars in scholarships to Central High School over these many, many, many years. So that came from A.L. Thomas Hardware. They had farm supplies, they had hop baskets, hay hooks, wire, all things, many, many items of inventory also downstairs. And so it was a big operation. Good competition for Western Auto. Upstairs, of course, was the Masonic Hall where the Masons met, and also the Eastern Star. And the Boy Scouts used some of that area upstairs at one time for their meetings in later years. Today it's a used bookstore, a beauty shop, I think downstairs still, and the YMCA and the space is for lease, or for sale, I'm sure, too. Next, in this area, in 1913 was the Isis Theater, and Billy K. Harold was telling me that tickets were at the theater at the matinee sometimes were like 15 cents. Popcorn was a nickel, and Saturday matinees were popular for the young ones. Next area there, and I don't know what the W stands for in the brick, but the J.C. Penney store. A typical older J.C. Penney store with a balcony and with the tubes. You put your money and the sales slip in the tube and pulled the handle, and it shot up to the balcony where the cashier was, and then came back down. Long underwear and work socks were under the balcony in the back. Marsh Powell was the manager, a good friend of my dad's. They used to sneak off and play golf once in a while together, but that was the J.C. Penney store, and a very flourishing business, and really busy, of course, during hop picking season. In this area, and I don't think in this little room, but anyway, there was another tavern there called the Club. And beyond that, where the bicycle rack is, there was a platform, and I think an old, like, mobile home there that had a grill, and they sold popcorn for the theater, but also hot dogs or hamburgers during the day on that platform. But the rest of them, before the mural, there was just a fence along the sidewalk to keep people from falling off about the 8-foot drop there. And so the mural was painted by Mel Blanchard many years after 1945, but has survived today. And I'm very pleased that it hasn't become a victim of graffiti. But it's an excellent historic picture of independence. Governor Vicatia came and dedicated it. Probably in the 70s, I'm guessing, whenever he was governor. 80s. I stood upstairs in the Opera House and took a picture of the governor at the dedication. The next building, which is now has just become Young Realty, was Johnny Holcheck's meat market. Johnny was a great fellow and had fresh cut meat. Where the restaurant sign is there today is the Naughty Noodle, and I'm not sure exactly of the exact location, but there was a restaurant in there. The Godfrey sisters, Helen and Hazel, worked there, and it was the Busy Bee Cafe. I used to go in and have a piece of lemon pie with ice cream on it. Vanilla ice cream, I remember, dessert. But anyway, the Busy Bee Cafe was in there. Next door was shoe repair. Weaver Bowler was the name of the gentleman that did the shoe repair business, and his wife, and I don't remember her name, but she would sometimes sit up in the front window crocheting and tatting. And I'm not sure what tatting is, but I'm sure all you ladies do know. In later years, Cliff Harden, barbershop. Cliff gave me crew cuts all through high school, and was again popular with the fellows at Independence High School. Today it's Ovenbird Bakery, and Katie, the owner of Ovenbird, is the daughter of Lorraine Newton, who was a second grade teacher at Independence Elementary School and taught all 3 of my children. So that's Ovenbird Bakery today. On the corner, initially a bank building claims to have the strongest safe in Polk County, but originally a bank building. 1945 or thereafter somewhat maybe, but Elmer Wade, another Elmer, had a meat market there. And the windows were such on Main Street especially that they would open, fold out, sort of accordion, so it would be wide open to the sidewalk, and you could walk in off the sidewalk up a slight slope and be then right in front of the meat cases. There was a corrugated building, corrugated siding directly behind it on C Street going down toward the river that my oldest son and I tore down, and the walls were full of sawdust for insulation, and so they kept some of their meats there when they first arrived. And we tore that down and saved some of the square nails and the timbers, and Sid Newton used some of those timbers when he built the blacksmith area that's in the Heritage Museum. and so he reutilized the timbers. Next, going north, where now the fountain is and the pillars, and by the way, if you have not, go by and look at all of the signs, the information on those pillars. And those same signs are also in the Heritage Museum, but it tells about the hop industry here. As I'm sure all of you know that Independence claimed to be the hop capital of the world in the 30s and the 40s. So much information there. We had hop queens and hop princesses. And the football field in 1945 was known as the Hop Bowl, and that's where Independence High played their football games through 1945. And then after that, a field was developed up behind what is now Henry Hill. And so we moved our football games to a higher ground. The Hop Bowl would flood some winters, not by rushing water, but by backup, and so it would be a mess. Back to the scene and where the pillars are and the fountain. In 1945, those were all businesses. The building on the corner of Main and C Street, going down towards the ferry landing, was a two-story building right across from what is now the coffee house, and a two-story building with a side door. It was reported, and I don't know for sure, that upstairs there were sometimes ladies of the night. Downstairs was a second-hand store. Rooms, buildings to the north, one was a cafe. And Raleigh Rogers tells me that they sold pork dinner sandwiches in the cafe, the Dinner Bell Cafe, for 25 cents. And some of the ladies who were visiting the cafe would then be able to send a order next door into the tavern, the Pastime Tavern, because ladies weren't allowed in the tavern. So their men would be next door drinking beer, and they'd suddenly get a 25-cent pork dinner sandwich delivered. Next room there was the Independence Enterprise, operated by Ralph Kletzing, K-L-E-T-Z-I-N-G, Ralph Kletzing, again a good friend of my dad's. Allowed me, my senior year in high school, 1950, I was asked to write a history of Independence, which is on this placard here. And so I spent many hours upstairs in a balcony in the newspaper office going through earlier newspapers. The West Side was an earlier newspaper in the 18s, so on. And so I was able to get, I looked for school articles as I went through the papers, and he also had the microfiche that I looked through. And did learn that the first graduates from Independence High School were in 1880, and Mrs. O.D. Butler, who lived in the Victorian house south across the street from the mortuary, was one of the first two people that graduated from Independence High School in 1880. And when we came to town, we rented a couple of rooms upstairs and lived upstairs in that house for a couple of weeks. Then the next building was Ben Mulman's, south of that then, back by the park, was Ben Mulman's garage. And Ben, besides having Chevrolet dealership and the Ford dealership, Ben also didn't stock any, but he was able to order Dodges and Plymouth cars. And he wore coveralls all the time and spent more time fixing lawnmowers and outboard motors in later years. But at one city council meeting, this whole block, where now is the park and the fountain and the pillars, this whole block, Clarence Thomas, one of the council people, says, and these buildings were not utilized that much, he says, let's push these buildings off the hill and down into the Hop Bowl. And that's subsequently what actually did happen. They dismantled those buildings. I remember when some of the bricks came down from the facades of those buildings, they skittered across Main Street and came up against the side of our Western Auto Store. But they knocked those buildings down and cleared it off, and it became then the opening to the Riverfront Park. On the corner there was a Hancock Station. Chuck Welchel was one of the early operators. Later, Theron Miller, my brother-in-law at the time, had a mobile station there, and now today it's Mechanical Barbecue. Next we go to the side streets, back to the Oddfellow buildings where Archer's is now, and with, again, Maxine's upstairs and all the shops downstairs. There's a sign for Maxine's. Those several rooms there at one time one area was Verd Morgan's bicycle shop. Verd repaired tube radios, later of course dealt in transistor radios. He also was a Schwinn bicycle dealer. And Schwinn was of course the quality bike, the Cadillac bike of the day. And we at Western Auto, even though we had the Western Flyer products, we decided we'd sure like to have a Schwinn dealership too. So we, in fact, eventually were able to gain a Schwinn dealership. I'm sure that we were probably the smallest town in America to have not one, but two Schwinn dealers in the same building. Verd was a character. He had a long antenna sticking out one of his handlebar arms with a flag on it, and sometimes he'd take off during the day or after he'd close his shop and ride bicycle across the bridge and on the river road, and had that antenna out there so that cars overtaking him would be sure to see him. Today, Ladies of Liberty have a shop in one of the rooms, and at one time there was a quilt store in there in past history. Getting to the alley, that mural was done by the same man that painted. So this is in the alleyway off of C Street. Next building was on the corner on the right there was Foster Plumbing Company, Roy Foster. Foster family had come from Nebraska like we had, and Perry Foster, Roy's oldest son, was a high school classmate. CrossFit has gone away, we've learned, but there is a dog wash in there and a beauty shop in about the place where Millie Kelly had a beauty shop in 1945. Millie was on Independent City Council at the same time I was. Sometimes I'd hiding behind the counters that we were sitting at up in the podium or in the front of the council room in Independence. I'd take off my boots and Millie would tell me to put my boots back on. On the corner, 1945, was Fulmer's Shell Service. Large family. Merle, the father, Almond, one of the boys. Junior and Jean were high school schoolmates, not classmates. And they, of course, had a large business there with automotive repair, I think even body work, and also were the Chevrolet dealership for Chevrolet cars and trucks. Across the street, in 1945, this was a vacant lot, and in the same newspaper that we had our store's grand opening double truck ad, 2 pages, on the front page was the architect's sketch of the new building to be built there that was to be M&F Grocery. Large grocery store, a coffee counter, meats, and so that became the M&F building. It's been a second-hand store for on and off for many years, and more recently has become the timeless second-hand. M&F, Morgan, and Forgard were the names of the 2 gentlemen that had a store, and they also had a store in, I think, Lincoln City, in the south part of Lincoln City later. Coming back down C Street, there's Al standing again, towards Main Street. Vacant lot behind me. There had been a small, narrow building there that at that time, 1945, was the Independence Post Office. Glenn Smith was the postmaster, and he and his wife lived up in the Blue House on Monmouth Street at 4th, the Queen Anne Victorian House. But Glenn was the postmaster, 1945. This building housed the Independence Telephone Company, an independent telephone operation, and I understand the last facility in the state that had hand operators. Coming back towards Main Street, and upstairs again, apartments up there, you're right. Another Elmer Barnhart actually had his name painted on the windows in the tower of the front building. Taken through some glass, but that's the restored stairway that goes upstairs to the apartments. The area next to the alley, then to the west of the stairwell here, in 1945 was Mrs. Carey's dress shop. Fine ladies ready to wear dresses. dresses for young girls, and I'm thinking even maybe some doll dresses. But Mrs. Carey had that shop. Bodie, the restorer of the building, tells me in other research that he's done on the building that in earlier years the dress shop area was a tobacco shop, cigars, tobacco, cigarettes, and today it has another business in there. Coming back then to Monmouth Street and heading to the west, this is behind where Taylor's Drug was the Independence Clinic. In the earlier years, Dr. Knott and Frotsky initially, and then later Dr. Serene, and even later Dr. Brust and Dr. Young. And the tax service and Farmers Insurance is in there now. The next picture we really took of the power pole and the lamp post there. That is where Independence City Hall stood, a two-story building, and like I said, the council met upstairs. Underneath the stairwell, which was a long, narrow stairwell right on the alley side, was the police station. On the corner was Hal Mellinger's service station, and so it's been a service station for years. Today it's Jimmy's. Steve Poff operated there, and before that, Ken Larson operated the service station. And where the newer library is today was Maurice Dodson's Union Oil, a large part of the block. And again, that's gone away, and our newer library. Independence Station, the bombed out, undeveloped, unfinished area to the west, in 1945 was Independence Lumberyard. Fred Zito was one of the employers there, and Herschel Greenwade worked there in later years, but it was the lumberyard, again with lumber supplies, building materials. Again, to the best of my memory, again, 72 years ago, but with the help of several people who helped me reconstruct what was where, when. So that's a recap of, again, downtown Independence, 1945. Thank you so much.